Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 69, Interrogation. What are you talking about, Leader-sama? Asked Itachi, not looking up from his book. I can see that Tsuchikage isn't Oanoki the one with dust really. Yes, Pain's voice rose an octave or two. Fuck. There goes the animal path. He paused. Why was I looking at the Tsuchikage, and what idiocy did your son get up to that got the man so all fired angry at me? I haven't the slightest idea, Leader-sama. Pain spent the next week trying to work out what his nephew was up to and avoiding the roundabout methods required for the Tsuchikage to reach him to demand answers. Since he didn't have any to give and didn't feel like admitting it, the only policy worth adhering to was to not have to do any answering. Besides, he didn't need a war with rock any more than he did with leaf. So far, Oanoki had been making threatening noises, but didn't seem inclined to escalate to threatening actions. That was for the best. Sasori had only a handful of reports of someone breaking into secure areas in villages. It was enough that Pain suspected Hari was working in clockwise order around the continent. He could assume, therefore, that any village without such a report was probably lacking in security. It wouldn't be like his nephew not to be thorough and, incidentally, create as much chaos as possible. Leader-sama? Itachi poked his head into Pain's office, where the man was forced to work on a small card table, because his desk was still occupied by Cinder Parrot. I found what you've been looking for. The Uchiha stepped sideways and from around the corner appeared Hari, his arm held tightly by his father. His other hand held an arm tightly, slightly decomposed and still wearing an Akatsuki cloak sleeve. He just turned up. Hi, Uncle Pain. Pain scowled. Didn't I say you weren't to leave the tower for business in the elemental nations without a personal escort by me? Hari held up the arm. You were with me. A pause. Well, some of you was. The next moment, Hari was absently holding the Deva Path's hands as it tried to get through his guard and strangle him. Damn. You made me drop you. Itachi coughed and Pain froze before slowly stepping back. That is not what I'd had in mind. Regardless, would you care to explain why the Tsuchikage was attacking me? Hari was sitting at the Tsuchikage's desk, a pile of scrolls strewn about him haphazardly. Many of them were opened only partway, and then tossed aside with complete disregard for their contents or integrity. At the moment, he was making a careful study of the one scroll that had been relevant to his interests. It had taken more time than he wished to access the hidden scroll room in the building, so he was running late. As a result, the Tsuchikage was already on his way back from the meeting. Hari had expected it to take the man longer to finish arranging the trade agreement and had budgeted more time than this. If he finished, he wouldn't have time to put everything back the way he had in other villages. His free hand held Uncle Pain, making sure that he didn't get left behind. The Tsuchikage opened the door and his face turned into a mask of fury. Hari. Pain said after a moment. Why didn't you put everything back? And I hate the idea of giving you this suggestion, just break in again. That would have put me behind schedule. Itachi. Get him out of here. He can explain what he was up to later. But you'll think this is really cool, Uncle Pain. Out. Uchiha Sasuke. Tsunade's voice was practically arctic as she addressed the sometimes genin in front of her. Do you know why I've called you to my office? If this has anything to do with paperwork, I'm leaving it off until Naruto can handle it for me. While that is an unacceptable plan, I figure I can turn things back over to him in about another week. I was more interested in discussing your nephew. Can we talk about paperwork, please? Sasuke said, face in his hand. No. I'm probably going to regret revealing a village secret to someone with a propensity for going missing, but otherwise I can't get your insight. You see, I walked in on your nephew about 3 days ago. He was in the area with the forbidden scroll and was, in fact, reading it. So, the village still has massive security holes. Considering that several dangerous individuals seem to wander through on a regular basis, I'm not sure that qualifies as much of a revelation. This would be the 3rd time my nephew has done it in as many years. And I'm pretty sure my brother and Hashige Kisame came in 3 years ago. So did Orochimaru and a giant army. To tell the truth, I think it's an improvement to have limited the last 2 years to just my nephew. Through Sasuke's little analysis, Tsunade's face had grown more and more grim. Grim. Be that as it may, each word was ground out. What I was hoping you could help with was what he was doing there. He was probably stealing something. Especially if it's unique or irreplaceable. He does that to Orochimaru. Twice at least. He has busy sprees, doesn't he? That's the problem. Nothing is missing. How odd. He made off with 2 highly valuable branches of Orochimaru's research. Does that mean there wasn't anything worth taking in the Forbidden Scroll, or any of the other things secreted away with it? Tsunade remained silent, glaring. That's rather sad, if you think about it. Maybe you should look into developing something impressive, so that it'd be worth his time? Now what was that about you turning things over to Naruto? I demand you reveal to me where his clones are hiding. Sasuke's response was to slip between the 2 ANBU restraining him and out the window before they could recover. ANBU, snarled Tsunade. We'll catch him, Lady Tsunade. Fuck that. Go find those clones. Hari. Pain and Toby stood in Hari's doorway, glaring. Yes? Hari was neck-deep in piles of paper covered in apparently random scribblings. We wish to talk to you about the gift you got Toby. What about it? Well, began Pain. The thing was fucking scary. Toby's voice was hard and brittle. It made some truly horrifying threats to my person and those around me. And it tried to curse me. It did? But it was a children's joke book. A little amateurish, but not that bad. Nevertheless, snarled Toby. Pain? Kakazu called from downstairs. Hayden wasn't able to make the kill again. There were books in there. Screamed Hayden. Pain sighed. How did this happen? Seriously. You've managed to psychologically scar someone devoted to violent murder and nothing else. How? Is something wrong with Uncle Hayden? Pain turned and stomped out of the room. Toby twitched. No books. Got it? Yes, Uncle Toby. I just know I missed something in that instruction. Toby left. Hari. Yeah, Dad? Hari looked up from staring at his new hand. Leader Sama has asked me to talk to you about a little problem he's having. Yeah? He's decided to include one of the training grounds in your confinement. Hari cocked his head to the side. You are allowed to use Training Ground 7 without needing Leader Sama to accompany you. Okay. In fact, he would appreciate it if you would move there promptly. Why? Itachi looked at the giant tree taking up much of the room, and which had, in fact, begun to take over a large portion of the tower with huge roots and branches. I couldn't say. I've been meaning to ask, Itachi said as he sat on a branch of one of many new trees that had colonized Training Ground 7. Each was a massive thing dwarfing all but the freaks in Training Ground 44 back in leaf. Thankfully, Hari hadn't imported any of the fauna from there, or Leader Sama would be most upset. Why did you implant the extra Sharingan into your arm? Hari glanced up from glaring at the trunk extending out of his palm. It was already putting down thick roots and beginning to twine itself with the others he'd created. Well, I figured that Danzo had them for a reason, so I might want them also. Do you know the reason? Itachi asked, worried his son had come across one of the darker secrets of their clan. Not a clue. But it's really weird to see out of my upper arm. You can see out of them? Yeah. I don't know why he kept them closed. Open is useful once I get used to it. I still trip a bit because I'm getting the hang of the new perspective. They won't be a weak point in a fight? Nah. They have some sort of hard film over them. Hari pulled a kunai and stabbed one of the eyes, demonstrating how the point glanced off the orb. It does that for the whole arm, actually. He gave a few more examples. I can't even scratch it without wind chakra. Did it do that before you attached it? Nah. I was a little concerned about that, actually. Now I wish I knew how to armor the rest of me without having to chop off more parts. I think it might just be the sage chakra. Oh. Right. Hari jabbed his thigh. So that drew a little blood. My new arm is definitely stronger. Please stop stabbing yourself. But it barely drew blood. Nevertheless, I posit that it is the sage chakra going through your new arm. Please do not go and armor yourself with the stuff. Okay, Dad. Thank you. Itachi casually leaned to the side as a tree limb sliced through the space he had occupied and tangled into the new forest canopy. Still having trouble with control? Sort of. I can stop it from growing things, but I can't control what it grows. Well, that's something to work on then. Aha. How soon do you need to get back to the other world? Probably tomorrow. Lady Tsunade. Shizun. What's wrong? Wait. Tsunade held up a hand, then rummaged around the pile of bottles that held her paperwork and found one with some sake left. She drained it and let it drop. Now tell me. What makes you think something is wrong? You're hiding behind my ANBU commander, for one thing. I like his butt. That's nice. Tell me the bad news. Uchiha Sasuke has fled the village. Do you have anything new to tell me? You knew? Well, I expected. I just finished reviewing another load of paperwork signed by acting head of the Uchiha Naruto, so I felt it was a safe bet that he was now actively going to make headaches again. Yes, Lady Tsunade. But at least we can just go retrieve him and lay waste to sound now. How will we do that, my lady? Asked the ANBU commander, not sure how he could politely explain to the apprentice of his superior that he was in a relationship already, and would she please remove her hands from his rear. Well, I was thinking of sending a couple of squads of your ANBU, and maybe toss in Kakashi and Guy to be certain of it. An excellent plan, only I meant that I wasn't sure how we would achieve your goals. I'm missing something, aren't I? We don't in fact know where sound is. Tsunade blinked. How is that possible? Well, we weren't told. Yes, but Uchiha Sasuke made several visits to TNI. How could we not know where Orochimaru's bases are? He refused to answer, Lady Tsunade. Get me a Ibiki. Ibiki, Inoichi, Tsunade purred, her smile not at all friendly. Would my esteemed officers of interrogation and information gathering care to explain why one of the most important ninja to pass through their custody recently failed to divulge key intelligence? He refused to answer, my lady, Ibiki replied, staring straight ahead and slightly to the left of Tsunade's head. I'm not sure why that matters, Ibiki. You are a torturer. I trust you know how to extract information from reluctant subjects. For that matter, she glared at Inoichi, you are able to just enter someone's mind and retrieve the information required. About that, Lady Tsunade. Inoichi looked a little sheepish and a lot scared. This had better be good. He claimed jurisdiction. What? He pointed out that as head of the Uchiha and, more importantly, head of the Leaf's military police, interrogation of captured missing ninja is the purview of the police. He handled it himself and turned in the reports as per the law. Tsunade's face twitched. I must have misheard you. I think you just said that you let a priority prisoner interrogate himself and write the reports. It was his right as head of the military police. Doubly so since matters involving Uchiha default to them. What the hell are you talking about? Ibiki growled at the boy teenager in heavy chains. The manacles on his arms were locked to the table, and those on his legs were attached to the chair. I think I spoke quite clearly, Sasuke said with a decidedly calm voice for someone facing the tender non-mercies of Marino Ibiki. I am head of the Uchiha clan and also acting head of the Leaf's military police. All actions involving captured Leaf ninja are matters for the military police. Furthermore, I am an Uchiha and Leaf's charter clearly states that all matters involving an Uchiha are the realm of the military police as well. Hence, I would ask you to please unchain me, so that I can interrogate the prisoner. I don't think that's... Ibiki was interrupted by one of his chunin, who handed him a piece of paper. But that's absurd. He snapped. He's the prisoner. If you claim I'm not really the head, you could always have my interrogation handled by Uchiha Naruto. Of course, that would be by mail, so it might take some time. And I suspect that he would insist that I not be chained up for the duration. It would probably be faster if you just let me do my job, Marino. Ibiki stared at the boy. This could not be happening. Fine. I'll get a Yamanaka, and he broke off when the boy's chained hand waved a finger. Sasuke said with a grin. Unless turned over to TNI by the military police, it's a crime to use those techniques on members of that organization or those in their care. Take, for example, an Uchiha accused of a crime. Ibiki's mouth worked silently as he tried to find some way that he could do his job. Do you mind hurrying it up? You're interfering with a police investigation. I don't think you want to be charged with that, do you? Unless you want to find out what the military police do to prisoners with their Sharingan? Ibiki glared. Now please unchain me. Sasuke waited for the man to do so. Thank you. And now, some privacy, please? I'd like to interrogate the prisoner. You have to be shitting me. Certainly not. Military police investigations are confidential. Only the Hokage gets the reports. In this case, I think I can be persuaded to give you copies of them. Professional courtesy and all that. Ibiki listened to the door slam behind him, and then heard the sound of the chair being ripped from its moorings and slammed onto the table. All right, you shit-eating traitor! Screamed Sasuke from inside the room. Are you going to talk? Too late. There was the sound of metal hitting flesh. How about now? We have ways of making you talk. On and on it went. Ibiki had dozed off to the peaceful sounds of a brutal, if insane, interrogation, and woke when he heard the door open. Uchiha Sasuke emerged from the room bloody and bruised with his clothing torn and both arms dislocated. A clone had a firm hand on one shoulder. I gave him everything I could think of, Marino, it said politely. It kicked Sasuke in the calf. I'll give him another go tomorrow, perhaps you have some suggestions for things I could use? In the meantime, he's confined to Leaf and its environs. It smacked Sasuke upside the head. Now get out. On his way out, Sasuke gave Ibiki a cheeky smile. Bye, Marino. You had to be there, my lady. The fact that he himself is technically a missing ninja doesn't change that? Well, no, Lady Tsunade. Legally he hasn't permanently designated Uchiha Naruto as head of the clan or military police, so while he's in the village, he's in charge. Are you telling me that Itachi could do that? Oh no, Lady Tsunade. The head of the Uchiha officially removed Uchiha Itachi from headship of the clan for the murder of the previous head. Thank heavens for small favors. Get out. Outtake . Then Granger walked to the door of the small suburban home he shared with his wife and daughter. There had been a polite knock, which wasn't so odd, but it had been in the middle of Christmas Day. That was unusual. Why would anyone come visiting today of all days? He was planning to tell whomever it was to kindly go the hell away. He wouldn't even do that much, but the gentle knocking had been going on for 3 hours, and had begun to alter the functioning of the family's thinking as it went on and on in a constant drone. He flung the door open to see no one standing there. The knocking on the door continued. He whirled around to see that there was nothing touching the door but his own hand. The sound continued to repeat over and over. While he stared, a boy with black hair strolled into his house and into the sitting room where his wife and child were covering their ears with their hands and humming loudly. "Merry Christmas, Hermione." Harry waved at the girl. "You." She snarled and went to try and strangle him, only to put her hands back to help drown out the sound. "I hope you're well. I got you a present." Harry pointed at the door behind him. "Motivation." "What?" "Now you'll practice your wandless magic so you can dispel the door." Harry patted Hermione on the shoulder and vanished in a cloud of flame. Chapter 70, Summer Continues. Bye, Dad. Goodbye, son. Itachi watched his son disappear. Itachi. Payne's voice was dry. Did you ever find out what it was he was doing all over the elemental nations? Something about wanting a summoning contract, Leader Sama. It cannot possibly be something so innocuous. Itachi sighed. You may be right, Leader Sama. Anyway, come to the planning room. We're coming up on the time when all the pieces are in play. Give it a few months and we'll want to be ready. Understood, Leader Sama. Orochimaru-sama. Kabuto knocked on the doorframe of the lab, reminding his lord that there were worldly concerns that needed addressing. I feel compelled to mention that Uchiha Sasuke has moved back into his old rooms and killed 3 of your servants who made snide remarks. He's back? Orochimaru looked distinctly uneasy. I believe so. It certainly looked like him with blood on his sword and a gibbering member of your bodyguard at his feet, while he poked holes in another of your protection because you just had to pick rude ones. Sound is made up of the dregs, damn it. Snarled Orochimaru. If I want skill, I have to be willing to deal with rude. Not enough skill, either, Orochimaru-sama. Kabuto smiled his not at all creepy honest smile. Yes, well, I blame you for their lack of training. Orochimaru sighed. He wasn't entirely certain he wanted the Uchiha around anymore. He definitely would make an excellent replacement body, but the boy came with that nephew and, also, a collection of protective uncles who had already made trouble for him. It was almost looking like it would be easier to just collect some of the boy's sperm and breed some new Uchiha. That was a thought. Kabuto, encourage Sasuke to spend quality time with our available females. I don't think he enjoys watching movies or walks in the park, my lord. Kabuto? Yes. Tell him if he's horny, he should fuck our breeding stock. Yes, Orochimaru-sama. The snake sage sighed and rubbed his face. Sometimes he wondered if it would have been easier to just stay on the right side of the Hokage and just stay in Leaf. On the other hand, he wouldn't be himself if he didn't push the limits of what was morally acceptable and, more importantly, didn't run the risk of annihilating his own sanity with some experiment. He was so lost in thought as he returned to his experiment that he only just dodged the hail of electrically charged needles that barraged his research facility. Hello, Sasuke. I gather Kabuto told you to train? Indeed. There was the sound of a sword being drawn. It was silken, and if Orochimaru hadn't been one of the greatest geniuses of the ninja world, he would have missed it under the boy's voice. As it was, he was forced to move awkwardly to draw his grass cutter and block the lightning blade in a flurry of fluid strikes. The combatants paused as a bird appeared in a cloud of flame and dropped a katana that was just a little large for Sasuke into the boy's hands. There was a note wrapped around the hilt. Dear Uncle Sasuke, he read aloud. Sorry I forgot to give this to you when I saw you last. Hope you're still in Leaf. Best, Uchiha Hari. P.S. I got you one a little bigger than you need now, so you can keep using it when you grow. Sasuke shrugged. Orochimaru was watching with fascination, so Sasuke drew the blade and experimentally moved it in a few basic forms. Electricity crackled from his fingers down the blade. Holy shit! At the sound of Orochimaru's voice, Sasuke dropped into a ready stance, the sword blurring through a defensive pattern. When you hold the blade at certain angles, I can't see you. Yeah, like that. Shit. The sound of birds grew louder as the Uchiha in front of Orochimaru began to randomly blink in and out of visibility while attacking. This was doing nothing for his mellow. Why can't you be more like my treasured apprentice? Jiraiya demanded as they left the brothel. Because I'm not catatonic with hormones, old man? This is true. But you'd think you'd at least be a little more interested. I even took you to a gay brothel. I'm not gay, pervert. I just didn't feel like screwing people twice my age. I don't mind that they're a third my age, brat. I can't even begin to answer that one. Look, I realize that you have some sort of notion of romance or propriety or something, but you need this training. You want to be Hokage, yes? Well, I'm not sure I can be, since I'm an Uchiha. Like you'd let a little detail stop you in pursuit of a goal. This is true. Well, the Hokage needs to be able to resist seduction. Besides, it'd piss off Tsunade. Why do you try to piss her off? Don't you like having your balls? Kid, if she were really mad at me, I'd be a pile of meat on the ground. That's how you know she adores me. Or you're just really resilient the same way I am. That too. What was the letter you sent to Tsunade a week ago? She sent me a letter with literal acid bile in it. Well, she wanted me to question one Uchiha Sasuke regarding the location of sound. Wouldn't that be a Biki's problem? Setting aside the fact that Sasuke isn't in Leaf anymore? No. He's Uchiha, so that makes it a military police matter. I'm acting chief of police, so that means it's my job. But Sasuke already handled the interrogation while he was in Leaf, so I don't see any reason to reopen a closed case just because the Hokage doesn't like the answers the prisoner gave. What? We're not barbarians, horny-toed sage. We don't just continue interrogations until prisoners say what we'd like to hear. Besides, Naruto pointed out, if we were going to do that, we could save some trouble, and just decide they said what we wanted to hear so we could move on. But look. The head of the military police already interrogated the prisoner. I'm not going to cast aspersions on his abilities as an officer. I wouldn't want him to do that to me. It's rude. Besides, he's a Leaf ninja and as a comrade, I'm supposed to trust his skills to get the job done when he's assigned to it, right? Technically. Good. What about the fact that he left Leaf again? He'll probably be back in a few months. It's like a vacation. Besides, we have no proof of that. He's not in the village. I'm not sure how to prove a negative, horny toad. You could at least call me sage, brat. Nah. Ow. Naruto's exclamation of pain was because he'd just been swatted into a tree. Get your lazy rear down here. We only have a few months before we have to go back to Leaf. You have training to do. Slave driver. Naruto created 1,000 clones, all of whom jogged off into the forest to practice technique chains. It was probably unfair to abuse his ability to do this, but you know, ninja. And you have practiced summoning to do. Yeah. Hey, Hari. Millie waved the unconscious prisoner in her hand at her friend when he appeared in a ball of fire. Could you hit that one over there? Thanks. He's death row, so that worked out. She proceeded to smack several other people with her human club. Summer job going well? Hari asked. He absently kicked a man in the face hard enough to cause much of his torso to explode in a shower of gore. Damn it, Harry. That one wasn't supposed to die. Then he should have dodged. Millie sighed and threw an unconscious prisoner into a group of them. She surveyed the drifts of beaten people and grinned. She called out in a thick, badly accented foreign language. What was that? Harry asked. French. They asked to borrow me for the riot. So, you're now becoming internationally known? I guess. Cool. Can I put you on staff, then? We'll handle the details. Harry held out a card. Sure. Neat. I'll have the word put out that I have someone who specializes in non-lethal. Non-lethal. You don't have to say it like it's a dirty word, Harry. Isn't it? Millie sighed and waved over the warden. Her French was slow and clumsy compared to the rapid-fire pace of the native speakers, but it was more than enough for them to communicate their desire to know who the heck had just appeared in the middle of their jail. I think they'd like you to leave since you're not supposed to be here. Why would that matter? Out. Fine, fine. Harry gave the warden a cheery wave. Harry stopped off in the museum again with as much casual ease as he'd had the last time he was there. It was simple enough to pick up the rest of his shopping list, and he made sure to leave behind a few things to let them know it was him again. Good morning, Tracy. Harry. Snapped the redhead. This is a hospital. Uh-huh. A Muggle hospital. And? You just appeared in a ball of flame. Harry waved off the growl of annoyance. Your baby brother's a little early. Still, it looks like it's going smoothly. It started already? Yep. Looks like easy births. Harry sat himself in a hospital chair, apparently perfectly comfortable despite the seat being made of some sort of plastic. What do you mean births? I think I spoke pretty clearly. It can be hard to tell that there's more than one as early as I saw. I hope you like being an older sibling. Oh my. Your mother seems to be quite put out with your father. Impressive, how she got a firearm into the delivery room. She didn't. Your father handed it to her. It isn't loaded, but it seems to be helping her calm down a little bit. Tracy covered her face with her hands. At least no one seemed to be paying attention to the fact that Harry had appeared suddenly. She'd take what she could get. Besides, they all seemed a little more concerned about the woman waving the gun in the delivery room. That might explain it. She was going to have to take special care with her siblings to ensure they didn't grow up to be as gun-happy as her mother. It wasn't good for her heart. Daphne and Astoria waved to Harry as he walked into the sunroom from the lawn. They didn't ask what he was doing there. It seemed a given that Harry liked to visit a couple of times a year. Daphne had just gotten used to it and Astoria liked seeing him. Hi, Harry. Astoria was about to jump up when a hand on her wrist kept her seated. Let him come over and sit down, snapped Daphne. Just for once. Harry plopped himself down in the seat across from the sisters. How's the summer treating you two? Aside from my sister's Nunda teething on the trees? Fine. They don't make magical things for Nunda to use for that? Most people don't keep Nunda as pets. Well, most people are silly that way. Harry leaned down and scratched the cub under the chin. It was already the size of a Great Dane and showed no sign of shrinking. I guess I'll have to figure something out then. Daphne watched in what would have once been disbelief, but was now resignation as Harry ignored the Nunda's breath completely. At this point, she was coming to accept that the normal rules didn't apply to Harry. It was one thing to consciously be aware of it, but her unconscious responses were no longer as shocked either. If there's nothing else, I have a few more stops to make and then still have a project before school starts. Nothing I can think of. Daphne watched him vanish. Now all she had to deal with in the way of a peaceful few weeks was her sister. That was going to be sufficient challenge without external difficulties. Hi, Harry. Pansy called. Sirius's head slammed into the side of the motorcycle. He'd been working with the girl to polish the chrome and retune the engine. Sure, you could do it with magic, but it wasn't as satisfying as doing it by hand. As such, he jumped at the abrupt greeting. That wasn't good to do when one's head was pointed at the side of a large, metal object. Ow. Sirius clutched his head and began to mutter curses. It wouldn't do to offend the idiots putting him up for the summer because they thought he was a mass murderer. They had grudgingly accepted that as the right-handed you-know-who, if he thought that riding around on a motorcycle was a good idea, then it was allowed. He didn't think they'd appreciate him swearing since their daughter already had a truly filthy mouth. Pansy had been cleaning her gun and her fingers were slick with gun oil, and she had the parts of her weapon arrayed around her. With Harry present, she quickly finished and reassembled her firearm, reloading it and chambering around. Good, he said absently. Disappointment, have you enchanted her bike yet? He means you, Pansy clarified when Sirius didn't respond. He's sad you're not, well, what he thought. She didn't want to say anything that might somehow get back to her parents. As it was, Sirius had made it clear he was probably going to have to clear out towards the end of the summer when his name was cleared. I figured as much, Sirius replied. But I long ago stopped responding to that term. It's not even the first time I was called that for the same reason. You'd get along great with my mother, Harry. Nah. She's dead. So, did you enchant the bike? Of course. Sirius sounded offended at the question. What do you take me for? Don't answer that. It's got the whole suite of charms and effects. We've had a chunk of time. Why she wanted it to have a field of bulletproofing is beyond me. I also installed a pair of forward-facing fixed-placement machine guns and a rear-mounted flak gun. Pansy shrugged. I didn't actually want them, but I figured you'd complain if I didn't arm it. This is true. Harry frowned. You went a little light on the weaponry. Well, I did want to actually have it resemble a bike when I was done. And I was going to have nowhere to sit with all the weapon controls if I put more on. Another project for me, then. Not on my bike, Harry. When he didn't respond, Pansy went on. I want you to agree, Harry. No experimenting on my bike. I have my own, he replied before vanishing. That wasn't an agreement, Harry. Blaze looked up and gave Harry a nod before going back to his book. He didn't bother to say anything when his friend decided to take a seat on the other end of the couch. His reading would be interrupted soon enough, so there was no reason to do so prematurely. Harry, purred Cersei as she sashayed into the room. She put an extra sway to her hips as she approached him, only to find herself almost stumble at the very appraising look he gave her. She wasn't used to feeling naked in front of someone, and his gaze looked right through her and evaluated everything. Blaze looked up in confusion as Harry walked up to his mother. She was not a tall woman and Harry had done some growing, so they were almost the same height. He moved strangely. It reminded him of his mother, actually. Then his friend leaned in and whispered something before disappearing, leaving his mother, blushing. It was a little trickier to tell with their complexion, but she was flushed. Harry just flirted with you, didn't he? He said mildly. Then he flushed with rage. I'll kill him. His mother waved him to silence with a sort of goofy smile on her face. No. That's not necessary. Her face turned predatory. I think it'll be interesting when he visits for Christmas. Blaze snarled. Hermione, I want to apologize. Hello, Harry, you what? I didn't mean to embarrass you when I popped in while you were changing. Oh. You couldn't have waited until I was out of the shower for this? Notice how I'm not facing you or your mirror. Hermione sighed. I suppose it's an improvement. Yeah. I'll go say hello to your parents. Harry. Hermione rubbed her forehead as he walked out of the bathroom and called to her father. Outtake. Dumbledore scratched his chin. The new bodyguard for the Potter boy was turning out to be a massive headache, but one that appeared perfectly capable of warding off attacks. So, it was best to take the good with the bad. It would normally be costing him a fortune to pay the boy, but at least dear Nicholas had donated his stone to the cause, so gold wasn't a problem. It was time to use the stone to make his monthly payment to the greedy bastard he'd summoned. He unlocked the warded room, and then the further warded safe, and used his blood to disable the locks on the package itself, and found a lump of quartz on a white glove. The next thing he knew, he was staring at the ceiling of the hospital wing. Chapter 71, in which we meet someone who will not die. Hey, Professor Wayne. Snape sighed and rubbed his eyes. Why his most troublesome student had decided to visit him during the summer again was, oh. Right. I have had only limited success with the project you gave me. I am beginning to suspect that there may be an inherent property in it that causes the lethal effects. If that is the case, you would need to contact an alchemist rather than a potions master. And probably someone on the level of Nicholas Flamel. He watched as Potter vanished in a cloud of fire and realized that it would be best if he never mentioned that it was his idea to send Harry Potter into the immortal alchemist's path. Especially if it ever got to Paranel. Professor Potter. The voice was aged, but contained a strength that put Harry in mind of some of the older ninja, the ones for whom age just meant that they hardened like oak. Your presence in my highly warded study is remarkable only in that it has taken you so long to violate my privacy. Harry found a well-dressed house elf, or, rather, wearing evening dress. It fit well, but the creature was ugly enough to offset the otherwise elegant clothing, ushering him to a plush armchair that he casually sat on the back of to avoid the spells inlaid on the cushions. He was a little put off by this, though. He had not been expecting a warm welcome. At the least, the man should be a little surprised. I know most people don't put stock in divination, the man went on, and I only believe it works in the short term, no matter what Brian believes. So, I thought you might appreciate some raw fish instead of the kippers I was going to have for breakfast. Harry blinked and waved away the elf with the food. He wasn't eating anything this man offered him. Considering the number of compulsions layered on the cup of water he was avoiding, there was too good a chance that he would be dealing with poisons he didn't want to worry about. Nah. I have to ask, how far ahead do your divinations see? Far enough. The man came out from behind a stack of books, revealing that his body, unlike his voice, was quite different from his age. He was a boyish man, with features no older than 25. His hair and beard were cut in a style that would fit into a painting from the time of Elizabeth I, though his dressing gown had the mark of Savile Row and a date from only 2 years gone. The pipe was clearly an affectation, since despite the ornate design, a stream of bubbles billowed upwards from the bowl. His brown eyes twinkled, though not as brightly as Dumbledore's. I know that if I continue to try and hit you with a compulsion spell, you'll just kill me out of hand. Or worse. True. True. Flamel laughed expansively, deep and resonating. At least you're honest. To tell the truth, all the compulsions in the house are intended to prevent the theft of the Philosopher's Stone. I wasn't planning to steal it. If I were, there's nothing you could do to stop me. Probably true. I don't want to test. Though I have to ask, if you're not here to rob me, why are you here? To kidnap you. The man blinked and sat in an armchair. That's uncommon. It must be 30 years since someone tried that. Could I convince you to tell me why? Well, Professor Wayne is having trouble with a project I assigned him, and he said that it might need an alchemist. And you're kidnapping me to give Professor Snape aid with homework? Yep. Well, if you'll give me a minute or two so I can collect my traveling alchemy set. Harry waved permission and began to take books off the shelves and memorize them. They had nothing at all to do with alchemy and most were comic books, but it never hurt to know what an immortal genius liked to read for pleasure. Who knew when it would come in handy? In fact, Harry made a note to stop in a few places during his summer travels. Snape blinked when Nicholas Flamel walked into his home and gave him a hug. Severus, my boy. I understand you're having trouble with summer homework? Snape didn't bother to correct the man. There were few enough people who actually liked him, for one thing. For another, the man was even harder to disabuse of a notion than Dumbledore. At least the headmaster was a pragmatist much of the time. Flamel had long since transcended normal human behavior. Or he thought it was funny. Snape could never tell. Professor Potter said you thought the issue might be alchemical. Or at least far enough out of the box that it would help to have the insight of someone who doesn't think in potions. One of these days I will get you to take up alchemy, Flamel insisted as he began to unpack his laboratory. Only after I have mastered everything about potions, Snape replied. I'm still not there yet. Harry boarded the plane for JFK after making a note on his list. The airport here in Hong Kong was amusingly familiar. Despite the refreshingly civilized food, there were plenty of English around. His trip through the greater Eurasian landmass had been productive. He hadn't even had to take very much, so there weren't many headlines related to his activities, although one French museum had been very upset when that wing had collapsed. He spent the flight sitting in first class, and enjoying peace and quiet as he mixed things in small bowls and doodled on a piece of parchment, working on a particular configuration. The nice stewardess brought him a glass of tea and otherwise stayed out of his way. There were several months' worth of reports waiting for him in his office, and he took a weekend to work on his compilations. It was amazing what you could learn with enough people in the right places. He'd want to consult with Uncle Sasori as to whether there was anything worth exploiting, but there were certainly things he could make use of. People were so uptight about certain behaviors. And the Triwizard Tournament was happening this year. He had no idea what that was offhand, but it sounded interesting. He would need to find out more details, but he had neglected to get much of a foothold in the games and sports department. Besides, everyone was preparing for the Quidditch World Cup. Harry looked up when an owl landed in his office. He hadn't had any contracts from the magical world and had not, in fact, expected to have any. Nevertheless, a job was a job. He opened the letter and read. When he finished reading, he had a broad grin on his face. Harry was paging through reports. Gringotts had sent their third request for more personnel since the contract started, and he was penning them an only mildly rude reply explaining that while there were other options theoretically available, those options lacked the finesse that Gringotts had specified in the hiring request, and that until such options presented themselves, at which time he would let them know, since they had right of first refusal to please, with respect, fuck off so he could get back to work. Things had gone well in the job in Mongolia, though he wasn't sure how there had been so many dead in a single camp on the steppes, but he wasn't being paid to ask questions like that. Or even to prevent deaths. So, it worked out. He nearly stabbed the owl that landed on his desk before realizing that it wasn't one of the Gringotts' flock. In fact, it was Pansy's owl, and it looked decidedly unhappy about the kunai a millimeter from its eyeball. He took the letter from it and watched the bird wing away with a degree of alacrity that could be considered impolite. He was going to mention how rude her owl was the next time he saw Pansy. Dear Professor Pronglet, it is with great gravitas that I write to inform you of an important coming-of-age ceremony among Marauders. As your godfather, it is my sworn duty, especially since your mother isn't around to kill me for it, to ensure that you are fully prepared for the best 4 years Hogwarts has to offer. To that end, you are invited and required to come on a trip with myself and Professor Werewolf to travel some of the world's houses of good repute in order that you might perfect certain skills required to get the best out of life. We have a week of debauched lessons to cram into a few days, so time-turners will be employed. If you wish to learn from the best, present yourself at the Parkinson residence today at noon. Your dutiful horn dog father. Sirius Orion. Yes, please more black. P.S. Stamina potions will be provided. Harry reread the letter and then filtered it through his Uncle Sasori lexicon, and his Uncle Haydn intention filter, and grinned broadly once more. Glad to see you arrived, pup. Sirius was waiting outside the Parkinson estate with a somewhat confused Mooney. The werewolf knew what was about to happen, but he wasn't sure why he was coming along. When Sirius and James had done this before their 4th year, they had dragged him and Peter along because they were friends. Besides, they needed him to plan out how to not get caught by their parents. To this day, he believed that James's parents were aware of what had happened and had decided to allow it. Or they were insane. Whichever. Well, I already spent a week mastering quite a few skills, but I would be remiss to not learn more. Harry was dressed as he usually was, unlike Sirius, who was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, massive sunglasses, and cut-off jeans, or Lupin, who was wearing a pair of shorts and a t-shirt that said "I bite." And I did not have any exposure to magical techniques, so that would be a nice addition to my arsenal. Well, it'll be added to someone's arse. Sirius chuckled and wondered if his godson had worked out what was going on, since the boy seemed smirking in a way that Sirius had been known to use for panty dropping. If you think you've got the basics down, then we'll head right in. Sirius, Lupin said as he watched his friend dig around in a satchel that clinked with potions bottles. Why am I coming along? Because you don't get to come along much. You're too self-sacrificing. Besides, you're on Wolfsbane and the full moon is 3 weeks away. This is the strongest you'll feel. Think of it this way, where we're going, they're paid to not care about things like being a werewolf unless you bite them, and turn them into a werewolf. Which can't happen. We'll be back long before then. But Sirius. Mooney, I'm rich. And I've lost 12 years of my life to Azkaban. I intend to spend a lot of money. I have 12 years' worth that I can't spend on me, so it's spare, and I'll spend it on you. Now stop complaining, you idiot wolf, and let's spend time with cats. Outtake. Headmaster? Snape asked quietly, sitting beside the old man who suddenly looked his age. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was ashen as best as could be seen with the giant beard. What in the fuck put you here? It was just as well that it was Christmas break. Pretty much only a handful of students had elected to remain behind with the threat of Sirius Black on the loose. Oddly, several of his snakes had stayed, and Potter, why was Potter in the Slytherin dorms anyway? He'd tried to have the boy removed and nothing seemed to work. We may have a problem, Severus. Albus said carefully. A problem? I gather you can't just have this one killed or arrested then. Or just abused into compliance. Not really, no. Someone seems to have taken the stone. Oh. Snape considered this for a moment. How? If I knew that, I doubt I'd be here, boy. Dumbledore's burst of rage had Snape in mind of his mercifully dead father. I'd be out hunting it down. But no one should have been able to get in. Perhaps your summoned mercenary did it? Dumbledore froze. Snape went on the upside, if we don't pay him, maybe he'll leave and we'll have fewer problems around here. And lose Potter? Dumbledore snarled. Black will kill him too soon. What do you suggest, Headmaster? I need a few more hours of sleep. Then we'll see about concocting a law that will allow us access to the funds of former Death Eaters. That should do the job. Chapter 72, Training. Hello, Pansy. Pansy jumped when Harry's voice came from directly beside her. She whirled, about to shout at him, only to blush at the grin on his face. Sorry we're late. Late? Why was he grinning like that? Yeah. We were supposed to meet you at your home. Harry's face fell into an easy smile and like that, the blush began to fade. But, a certain person had to settle up some extra debts we might have incurred. It was quite fun though. Debts? There were people unable to work for a week. They needed to be compensated. Harry paused. Not that they had been complaining. Not going to ask. Hello, Professor Lupin. You look very relaxed. HM? Oh yes. I'm feeling very relaxed indeed. Sprinkles wanted to be here to see you off, but he's feeling quite exhausted. We were both quite impressed by Professor Potter's skills and ability to learn. Still not asking what you're talking about. Probably for the best. Your parents wouldn't approve. Probably. Lupin looked a bit unsure. Right, well, best to get on the train. Harry waved to Professor Werewolf and trotted to the cabin reserved for prefects. It was gratifying to find that no one had tried to appropriate it. He waved to Tracy, who was looking very glad to be going away from the home with 2 newborns in it. She was half asleep on a couch and didn't respond to his greeting. Harry had settled in to do a bit of paperwork. Pansy was reading some Muggle book that Sirius had recommended and snickering now and again in a way that suggested she was enjoying it. She also had a pair of headphones on and was bobbing her head to whatever song she was listening to. Daphne walked in scowling and dragging a Mastastoria behind her. Harry didn't know why girl Toby didn't just escape, but perhaps she was having fun? Tam hadn't said a word about Harry forgetting to visit, but she seemed pleased to have had a little more peace and quiet than expected. Blaze, on the other hand, was seething and only stark terror kept him from trying to shout at Harry. Then Millie turned up with bloody knuckles, a black eye and a broad grin. Harry. Hermione stormed into the compartment with the Daily Prophet and a clipbook of the Times clutched in her fists, her face a rictus of fury. She threw the magical paper at him, frowning when he caught it without looking up. Well, what? He made a note in a ledger and turned a page. What have you got to say for yourself? Hello, Hermione, I hope you had a good summer. She paused. Thank you. But I mean about the World Cup. I don't follow football, was his immediate response. Or do you mean the Quidditch Cup? Did something happen? Hermione stood with her mouth agape for several long moments, during which the train began to move. Yes. She snapped finally. Something happened. Harry looked up, his face set in an expression of great interest. What was it? There was a massacre, Daphne said, relenting and allowing Astoria to tear out of the room with a gleeful scream. Oh? Yeah, she leaned back and massaged her forehead as shrieks bounced off the corridor walls outside. Apparently some bloody geniuses got it into their heads to send a message about how the dark is to be feared. Or something. They dressed up as Death Eaters and went out to terrorize the campsite in the wake of the cup Ireland won, by the way. All right? Replied Harry, clearly not following. Harry, many British families were there. Families whose children are your students. And there were the recent graduates and the Aura trainees and several others. Hermione sighed. They slaughtered the entire group. No prisoners or anything. Well, yeah. I did teach them that prisoners are only to be taken for a purpose. They nearly caused an international incident. Hermione shouted. But they didn't. Well, no, Hermione seemed unhappy to admit it. Apparently going around dressed as a terrorist organization is something frowned upon, especially when trying to terrorize people. Once it became clear that all the dead were foreigners who had gotten the bright idea to attack your students, well, the ministry called it suicide and suggested that any foreign government that had a problem with it should stand up and say that attacking civilians at a major sporting event was acceptable. There was a remarkable lack of complaint afterwards. You don't say. But your students turned part of the campground into charnel pit. It was only the work of a dozen skilled forensic specialists that let them even identify the remains. There were no local wizards killed? Harry asked. Not a one. Pansy had taken off her headphones and seemed to be taking great joy in Hermione's displeasure. I get the impression that none of the locals wanted a thing to do with it. She paused. I heard my parents talking. It sounded like the Malfoys got wind of something going down and decided they had celebrated enough, went home early for a good night's sleep. Same with the Crabs, Goyles, Yaxleys. Every local wizard who heard what the foreigners planned made a point of being at home in their own beds before the moon was high. So, a bunch of people trying to cause trouble died bloody deaths. What's the problem here? Hermione glared at her friends, most of whom were nodding their heads. It's just that they nearly got us into a war. Stop looking pleased at the prospect. That explains the profit, Tracy murmured, her eyes opening for a moment and then closing. What about the scrapbook? I can see clippings from the Times poking out. It has been an interesting summer, Hermione explained, sitting down and opening the book. A strange series of break-ins. Museums all over the world. Archaeology departments finding samples going missing. The British Museum lost a few things from the vault. Someone stole the oldest copy of the Magna Carta. Only a small fraction of the missing things even has any intrinsic worth outside of the scientific community. And? Daphne prompted. And there was no evidence of who did it or why. Except for a white glove in the British Museum. Still not seeing your point. Do you know anyone else who could do that? She has a point, Harry. Harry looked up from his ledger. Oh, sorry. What were we talking about? Your little robbery spree over the summer. I bet they didn't even find most of the places you broke in, did they? Hermione brandished an atlas with handwritten notes scrawled over the maps. They didn't find the one in Cairo, did they? Or the one in Madrid? Or more than a dozen others? All museums with serious archaeology departments. Some of the notes had dates. You wanted something. I didn't know you were into conspiracy theories, Hermione, Harry replied mildly. Hermione threw her hands up in the air and scowled. Well, think of it this way, Hermione, Tracy murmured. If he was busy robbing museums, that means that he probably wasn't responsible for the event in Mongolia. Thank goodness for small favors, then. But even so, what on earth would I want in a museum? Harry asked, making a few notes in his ledger. Apparently you wanted samples of bones. Odd. I'm not really into scrimshaw, you know. Though now that you mention it, bone does make a good base for certain kinds of poison and curse enchantments. Old ones are usually stronger, greater connection with death and the afterlife and all. Hermione covered her face with her hands. Please tell me you're not planning to mass-produce some kind of death magic. I'm not planning to mass-produce death magic. Harry sniffed. You have no faith in me. On the contrary, Pansy muttered, we have a great deal of faith in you, that you will find new and terrifying uses for magic that unleash death and chaos on the world. Harry opened his mouth and then closed it again. Fair enough. The train moved along at a steady pace and Tracy had finally dragged herself out of her stupor to contribute more than a sentence or two. She was definitely thrilled to be away from her new brothers. They were cute when she put silencing charms on them, and her mother had declared that anyone who tried to raise children without magic to clean up was either a saint or just plain crazy. Tracy agreed with that assessment. Most of the time, Tracy just stayed out of the way and found something to do, but with a pair of babies, her mother had ordered her to help on the grounds that she could use magic. It meant that her father sometimes could get a bit of sleep. She was almost used to her mother nursing in the living room, but it still felt a bit weird. Daphne was in a discussion with Hermione about their upcoming classes. Third year was almost exclusively devoted to foundational knowledge. It was all about the absolute basics necessary for a discipline, the ones that could be used pretty much no matter what path of study was eventually taken. Fifth year was always prep for exams. Anything during the NEWT years was strictly self-directed as far as their classes were concerned. The fourth year was the one that was most variable. It depended on the professor. Some of the students going into their fifth year had shared their experiences, but the curriculum was changed regularly. Pansy was still reading her book, leaning on Millie's shoulder, as the large girl changed the bandages wrapped around her hands and cleaned her various blunt instruments. There were an awful lot of them, and they all needed a thorough going over to get the blood off. Blaise seethed and Tam was writing in a diary. Hello, Malfoy, Harry said as the door slid open. Potter, hello. What do you want? Hissed Pansy. Well, I wanted to ask Professor Potter if he knew about the Tri-Wizard tournament happening this year. Yep, Oh. Why did you want to ask that? Pansy asked, eyes narrowed. My father decided that after the World Cup incident, it would be best if Professor Potter were aware of how we could be helpful members of society. Funny that. I don't have any of the details though. Harry said. Excellent. Draco grinned. My father made me memorize everything he knew. He asked that you please let everyone in your classes know that he's capable of being a non-dangerous member of society at least once a month. I don't have classes to teach this year. Right. Malfoy rolled his eyes and sat down on a spare couch that put Millie between himself and Hermione. I'll start at the beginning. What is the Tri-Wizard Tournament? Asked Daphne. Officially? It's a way for the 3 premier schools of magic to get together and strengthen international ties. I take it, then, that there is an unofficial purpose? Hermione said. Several, depending whom you ask. One theory says it's basically a pissing contest, like a way of showing which school has the biggest magical penis. Another one says that it's advertising to get students to attend the school that one makes less sense, though. People often attend either the nearest school or one with which they have familial history. The last one I know of says that it's a substitute for war. A way for the major magical powers in Europe to compete without the mess of full-scale battle. My father figures that the last one is a bit far-fetched. Especially since there have been plenty of wars since the tournament. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but it makes sense. I'm sure if we asked Granger, she could cite all of the major conflicts. I'm not asking you to. And he's the one who pointed out that most students end up at the same schools their parents go to. My mother likes to joke that I almost ended up at Durmstrang, but she didn't like the uniforms, but the fact is that pretty much everyone from the Black family went to Hogwarts since they got to England with William the Conqueror. At the risk of interrupting your explanation, Hermione said, what about the Malfoy family? Got to England way later. We didn't come in with a conquering king, so I can't remember the exact year, but it was sometime around Henry VI, I think. We're thoroughly English since then though. == make ==. Uchiha Sasuke was running madly towards the border of Lightning Country. More importantly, he was headed for the mountains there because there was an exceptionally angry bounty hunter trying to severely maim him. Thanks to his Sharingan, he'd been able to dodge the various blasts flung at him, but this was out of his league, so he was following Orochimaru's teaching that fleeing a fight he couldn't win was the better part of living to fight another day. Kakuzu was tenacious and had a century of combat experience and, given that Sasuke's Sharingan was just barely giving him an edge, probably sparred with his older brother. It was just as well he'd managed to lose Karen right after killing the target. She would be well out of the line of fire. And lightning. And water. S-rank ninja were really dangerous people. While Sasuke would be personally fine with Karen getting turned into a roasted stalker, the fact was that Orochimaru considered her a valuable asset, and would be put out if Sasuke got her killed. Trying to protect that useless fangirl wasn't something to be done, while avoiding someone who was probably the most experienced shinobi alive. Sasuke jumped, spun, flung a handful of Senbon charged with lightning in the general direction of his pursuer, landed, and took off directly to his left at a dead run. Kabuto was right about one thing. There was nothing quite like fleeing from an enemy of Kakuzu's talent to force one's skills sharper than ever. That was why he was being sent after bounties that were likely to attract the elder ninja's attention. It had become a familiar dance he did with the former Waterfall elite: get to bounty first, kill bounty, flee enraged S-rank ninja, repeat. Karen was always useful in tracking the target, but the trade-off was having the clingy girl around him, and that was more a punishment than anything. It almost would have been worth it for Orochimaru's attempts to breed the two of them, taking if it meant she'd be kept back and sound for the duration of the pregnancy. Almost. But then he'd have another Uchiha with unstable parents, and he was unstable enough on his own. His clan needed nice, stable influences. Or Naruto. Still, it had been possibly the worst way he could be introduced to the world of love, or at least sex. Karen had been too nervous to be of any help no matter how eager and willing, and he hadn't been particularly attracted to her, and, in fact, wasn't quite sure what he was attracted to, since he spent much of his time in Sound, where the women were too crazy for him. All that fumbling and tears and apologizing, her, not him. He wasn't going to apologize for something he was being ordered to do, and was faintly disgusted by, and it had been an uncoordinated mess, made worse by Orochimaru trying to give instruction. The man was so clinical about it. And having the creepy snake sage observing wasn't the kind of thing to help gain or keep an erection. Sasuke dodged into a cave network, and then out through a hidden exit, doubling back on the man chasing him. Thankfully, Orochimaru had pretty much given up on Karen as breeding stock, and Sasuke had managed to put off any further attempts. It was only a matter of time before he was strong enough to put down the man, and then he could get on with his duty to clean up the stain of the Uchiha. Leaf might have some objections, but Naruto would smooth things out. Chapter 73, An Expected Yet Unexpected Arrival. Or when things get interesting early. The Tri-Wizard tournament sounds incredibly dangerous, Hermione said when Malfoy had finished explaining. It is, Granger. People regularly die, and they stopped having it after the 5th time in a row without a champion because everyone was dead. Dead. And they're restarting it? Daphne asked, sounding incredulous. They are. I hear they're limiting entry to those already of majority, so I'm going to bet on Professor Potter winning. He's not reached majority though, Hermione felt compelled to point out. And you think that will stop him? Millie replied. Winning it sounds like fun, Harry added. Pleasure talking with you, Malfoy said, rising. I quite like not being hit in the head with books for a change. Good day. He nodded politely and left the compartment. Does anyone else wonder that he didn't comment on us being in the prefect's cabin? Blaze murmured. Nah. Were we ever that scrawny? Daphne pointed at the line of tiny first years who were toddling into the great hall to line up and await sorting. Depends, said Pansy. Do you mean in general? Or that one who's soaked to the bone and grinning like an idiot? Both. I don't know if the chubby one on the end counts as scrawny, for one thing, Daphne. But setting that aside, I guess we must have. I mean, I don't remember being so small, but how could we not have been? On the other hand, the one who's waving to someone at the Gryffindor table is absolutely tiny. And none of us were quite that undignified. He's dripping on the floor. So's the head girl, commented Harry without looking up from a book he was reading. But she's not wet. Hermione objected. As far as you can see. The group ignored Hermione's scandalized gasp. What makes it interesting is that the two boys don't know about each other. That got their attention. The head girl is sleeping with two people? Pansy demanded. Sleeping was definitely not involved, but yes. Who? Does it matter? Yes. Daphne and Pansy hissed. We could blackmail her. Daphne explained. What for? Harry asked. I mean, really. What do we need? The future is unforeseen and therefore having useful information is of undetermined value, said Daphne. It was natural for a Slytherin, even one who was in close proximity to Harry for extended periods, to want information. It was lightweight and as powerful as a spell when used in the right way. A Hufflepuff 6th year and a Ravenclaw 7th year, Harry said. Hufflepuff 1 is Drew Faintree, the one with the brown hair that always sticks up. Ravenclaw is Alan Rupee, green eyes and blonde hair with the silver earring in his left ear. I can't say I approve of her choices, muttered Pansy. Agreed. I don't think Rupee washes. His hair is greasy. Faintree's a beater though. He's probably got some nice muscles. There is that. Are we having girl talk at the dinner table? Grumbled Blaze. I came to school to get away from that. If it helps any, I'm not interested in the discussion either, offered Hermione. Though I don't know why we're discussing someone else's sex life at all. Information is power, replied Daphne and Pansy. Really, Hermione, Daphne went on, you read books constantly and constantly try to learn more. Why haven't you realized yet that it's not only academics where that drive should be put to use? You're a Slytherin. We are cunning and ambitious. She looked at Harry. And Harry. But he doesn't count. Anyway, the point is that you sometimes need to grease the wheels a bit in service of ambition, and one should go about that via cunning. Or Harry. Hermione shook her head. I'll get where I'm going on my merits alone. One could argue that being a good blackmailer is a merit, Harry commented. No, it isn't. Dumbledore stood. His beard stuck out as though he had shoved a finger in a light socket and smoldered gently. His glasses had been replaced with dark sunglasses. On his head was a pointed, purple hat made of velvet with a leopard print design around the edge, and a feather almost as tall as him sticking out of it. His robes were purple velvet with leopard print lapels, and he had a cane with a disco ball made of glass on the top. His wand launched a fireball into the air which exploded, raining down a layer of flaky, white ash onto everyone. Thank you for your attention. We will begin the sorting now. Please show the proper reverence for this momentous event by shutting your pie holes. Also, Ms. Wax will please shut her mouth, not stuff it. There were a few moments of silence before a red-headed girl with rumpled robes slipped out from under the Gryffindor table and took a seat, her face a blazing scarlet. Thank you for joining us. Dumbledore seemed to consider something for a moment, his hand forestalling Professor McGonagall, who had drawn her wand and was advancing on her house table with a look of murderous incredulity. Though I appreciate your devotion to preventing pregnancy, you may want to ask Mr. Earthart why he was able to perform while looking at an old man. He twinkled at the hall with a beatific smile. The sorting took remarkably little time. Either the new students were all demonstrating strong house leanings, or the hat was getting better. Or bored. Both were plausible. The distribution of students wasn't quite even, but Hufflepuff was only slightly better represented than the others, by a duo of students whose entrance had been welcomed with the usual badger-y cries of approval. To the shock of no one sitting near Harry, the boy who looked like he was ecstatic to have been soaked to the bone ended up in the house of the cannon fodder where someone who bore a passing resemblance to him offered a hearty greeting. The few new Slytherins sat quietly, unsure of how to proceed. No one really talked about house politics at home these days, so it wasn't entirely clear with whom they should begin cultivating alliances. Daphne Greengrass sat at the center of the table, surrounded first by others in her year, and one third year, and then a ring of empty space before the rest of the house. It certainly looked like she was holding court. But she didn't have the air of a queen to her. Never mind that she was a fourth year, she didn't expect others to let her speak, or to agree with her. That much was clear from the quiet argument about blackmail that had resumed the moment the last student had been seated. It was all very confusing to them, and they resolved, each on his or her own, to sit and wait. Slytherin was not the house of jumping to conclusions. At least, not in theory. Now then, Dumbledore said when the new students were seated. We have our usual start of year announcements to deal with. Firstly, despite requests from the ministry, there will be Quidditch this year. I simply could not condone the cancellation of one of our most popular sporting events simply because the pitch will be needed shortly before the finals. It's not as though we couldn't just have them sooner. And I refuse to accept that it would detract from the interest in the primary event this year, you old fart. So those of you still enamored with flying around in dangerous ways and trying to kill yourselves and others in the process, you will have your opportunities. I am sure that the heads of houses will want to have their tryouts at some point, and will kindly arrange the scheduling of such matters on their own time. Secondly, we will be having the Triwizard Tournament at Hogwarts this year. You will be forgiven for not knowing what that is. It has been a few years since the last one. To give you an idea of what that means, I wasn't born yet. The event is a competition between the three most important magical schools in Europe. Complaints that there are other important schools have yet to convince us that they count as equally important. The event is a series of competitions between the school champions, one from each school. The challenges will be dangerous and potentially lethal. We expect that only some of the contestants will survive. I, for one, am willing to risk that someone else will die on their quest for glory. I won't tell you what the tasks are because they are supposed to be secret. I'm talking to Mr. Malfoy here, by the way. As a direct result of the tournament, we will be hosting the upper classes from both Bookspatens and Durmstrang for much of the year, starting with October 30th. I won't tell you to be on your best behavior, because I have no doubt you wouldn't bother. Messrs. Weasley, for example, will no doubt try to prank as many people as possible. I ask only that you keep in mind that being implicated in an international incident is not only not a laughing matter, but one that could result in actual punishment from authorities other than your school. While most other announcements could wait until you have been fed and watered, as I suspect your young bodies demand in all their hormonal chaos, I wanted to address a matter of staffing. Professor Weirwool Lupin resigned at the end of our previous year, citing the need to not teach such violent maniacs. Since we were left without a defense professor, I was expecting to need Professor Potter's assistance once again. Dumbledore allowed a moment of cheering before waving for silence. But in light of the tournament taking place, I was politely asked to allow a specialist to oversee things related to security. Far be it from me to second-guess a moron like our minister when he insists I get outside aid. Currently missing from the head table is the new professor in question. The doors banged open. In walked a man upon whom the term grizzled seemed insufficient. His hair, while clean and white, grew haphazardly across a scalp so crossed with scar tissue that it resembled the battlefields of the Great War. What little hair there was had been not so much cropped as buzzed until only a scant inch extended out of his head. He had probably had a nose once, but it had been mashed, broken, hacked, gouged, and slashed until it was a shadow of its former self. His lips were drawn into a sneer on one side, more scars pulling his cheek up and away, while on the other side his mouth had been cut away in a ghastly parody of a smile, bearing his teeth in the manner of a skull. One eye was brown and had a feverish light to it, burning with the kind of energy that allowed a man to keep moving after his body had been ravaged by violence beyond repair. The other was the blue of the sky, completely, and with only a single dot in the center. It swiveled about wildly and independent of the other, sometimes vanishing as it rolled all the way back. His left hand, the only one extended from his robes, was gnarled and battered. It was missing the ring finger entirely and the last joint of the pinky. Carved into the back of the hand was a rune for protection that somehow managed to be seen despite the overlapping scars. Clutched in his remaining fingers was a cane. It was a long, sturdy length of wood, stained with splashes of dark color that resembled dried humors. The head of it was a lump of some unknown metal around which the wood had grown. Has decided to make a dramatic entrance. Dumbledore's tone was decidedly unamused. Alastair Moody, retired Auror and well-known violent maniac, has graciously volunteered to come out of retirement and teach my students how to become paranoid sociopaths. He seemed to consider that statement. Actually, that may not be anything new. Regardless, it's so nice of you to join us for dinner. The hall was silent except for the step-thump of the new professor's halting gait. The swish of his robes revealed a wooden stump that he had to drag along each time he stepped forwards. That's interesting, said Harry. Professor Snape tried to eat without looking at Professor Moody. The man had already accused him 3 times of being a traitor and a murderer. While both were technically true, all right, more than technically, it still wasn't nice to have those terms thrown at you by a man whose hands were soaked in blood. Besides, the only thing he'd been guilty of recently was tolerating the antics of one of his students whom he couldn't control if he tried. It was tiring, really, to hear the same accusations from the man that he'd spouted every time they encountered one another. An unfortunate side effect of the man being Dumbledore's friend was that he came around now and again, and never failed to attempt a burglary of Snape's quarters in order to investigate. And then to make further accusations upon discovering that Snape had prevented that intrusion. It was because of his studious avoidance of the man sitting next to him. It was also a singularly terrifying and disgusting experience to see the man chew, that he saw Pansy Parkinson stand up from the Slytherin table and meet his eyes. She walked towards him, a determined look on her face. He wondered if there was going to be a way to get her to stop wearing those slit-thighed skirts, because he really didn't want some idiot to forget himself and get shot for staring. "Miss Parkinson," he said as she reached the head table, standing on the opposite side and gazing steadily at him. Then she launched herself up, using her left hand to support her weight, and swung her body over the table, her knees slamming into Moody's chest, knocking him backwards to the floor with a clatter of wood, and her right hand smoothly drawing her gun and shoving it into the man's mouth. "Equals make equals." Tsunade looked at the reports from Jiraiya. They were well written, concise, and detailed. The man had made intelligence work an art form. She still had trouble believing that her idiot fuck-up of a teammate who had never failed to be the one who caused whatever calamity they were escaping, who had spent more time asking her out and flirting with any pretty girl he saw, who had once decided to copy her teacher's technique without a summoning contract and ended up becoming the student of a bunch of sentient toads. He was also the spy master of the largest village in the elemental nations and had, with few exceptions, proved to be better at his job than his opponents were at theirs. Presently, she was reading an account of a battle that had taken place on the border of lightning between a ninja, who was not technically a missing nin, and a man who was over a century old, and had fought her grandfather, been trounced by him accidentally, but that counted as fighting Grandpa Hashirama most of the time. Since as far as she could tell, no one but the combatants had been present, she was at a loss for how he had a nearly blow-by-blow record. He also reported that the Akatsuki were getting ready to move soon, and so he and Naruto would be returning to the village. Why was he coming back to the village if their enemies were likely to be on the move? This seemed like the ideal time to hide away their target, but since Jiraiya was the spy master, she assumed he had a reason, and that he would explain when they got back. He would explain. She liked Naruto, despite him being a colossal pain in her ass thanks to his antics with the council. Speaking of Naruto, Dragon. An ANBU appeared in front of her. "How goes the search for infiltrators?" "We've caught 16 enemy agents in the last month and a half, Lady Tsunade." They were promptly turned over to TNI for debriefing and exemplification. "Damn the foreign ninja," Tsunade growled. "I want to catch Naruto's clones." Dragon didn't move, but behind his mask, his eyes flitted back and forth in panic. As far as his ANBU could tell, there were no clones, but the boss was insistent and one didn't argue with the boss. "Yes, my lady." Dragon saluted and fled before she could interrogate him further on the matter. "Infiltrate my village." Tsunade shook her head. "Damn Uchiha. Maybe Great-Uncle Tobirama was right." Chapter 74, Forearmed is Forewarned. Right. The high table and, indeed, the great hall were a tableau of contrasting attitudes. The seventh years had grabbed the furs ties and shoved them under the tables while casting protection spells. The rest of the student body had all begun throwing personal shields up over themselves. At the high table, the teachers' responses were a study in personalities. Most of the staff were agog, despite years of experience with Professor Potter's monsters. Minerva McGonagall had her hand on her wand. Flitwick, a champion duelist and veteran of the recent conflict, had his wand out and pointed at Pansy Parkinson. Severus Snape, a specialist in dark arts, violent combat, and HarryPotter had his wand in his hand and was deciding whom to point it at. Albus Percival Wulfric Dora the Explorer Brian J. Dumbledore had his wand pointed at Mad-Eye Moody. Snape was the first one to move. He had observed Dumbledore's response and decided that the man probably had a better grasp of the situation than he did. He therefore pointed his wand at Moody. "Headmaster, while I'm not going to doubt your judgment, may I ask why we're aiming our wands at the victim of an unprovoked assault?" While there are several reasons, Dumbledore's voice possessed an unusually hard edge to it. The one that springs most readily to mind is that the real Alastair Moody wouldn't have been caught by that attack. Real. Flitwick felt that he was coming late to this party. "Didn't Miss Parkinson attack Moody?" "No," Pansy snapped. "I attacked someone pretending to be Mad-Eye Moody." "Well, I commend you for your impressive way of preventing him from resisting," Dumbledore commented, suddenly mild as milk. Severus, would you be so kind as to fetch your Veritaserum? I do believe that there are questions that need answering. Snape eyed his student, who looked disturbingly comfortable with her firearm shoved into a man's mouth, ignoring the blood bubbling up from where she'd knocked out his front teeth. Miss Parkinson, please refrain from taking a human life unless you really have no other choice. As long as he doesn't move, I won't be getting a lesson in the appearance of human brains, she replied, glaring at the man under her knees. If he breathes too loudly though, well, I might flinch. A flash of red light struck the faux professor. As much as I appreciate your solution, Miss Parkinson, I do believe that he might choose death over being questioned, and I don't intend to give him that option. Dumbledore motioned for her to rise. Do return to your table. I think we shall finish our meal, and then sort out this man. Professor Potter, would you see to it that this man remains alive, capable of answering questions when I need them answered, and in my office until later? Pansy glared as she walked past Harry, feeling that this was going to be trouble, and it would somehow be his fault. Harry calmly picked up the unconscious man and struck him once in the back. There. His limbs are paralyzed. I'll make sure he doesn't bite off his tongue while we wait. He tossed the man over his shoulder and walked out of the hall. Pansy was listening to her friends. Most of the conversation was a riff on the theme of was that really necessary? And she was getting tired of it. They probably would react badly if she pointed her gun at them, though, so she just focused on eating her food and trying to silently project to their minds that she was entirely certain that she'd done the right thing. Thank you very much. Miss Parkinson. Pansy whirled and just barely avoided firing on the headmaster, who just observed the gun pointed at him with polite interest. Before I go have a word with Professor Potter's prisoner, I was just wondering if you would enlighten me. Yes, I thought it was absolutely necessary, Headmaster. I'm glad you think so. I would hope that such actions would only be undertaken when you are sure. That is not, however, why I am here. I don't think he was technically a professor, so Pansy shouldn't be in trouble for assaulting a member of the faculty, Hermione pointed out. I mean, if he's an imposter, he isn't really on staff, right? A fair point as well. Also, not my purpose. All right, Pansy said slowly. Why are you here? I just was wondering what gave you the impression right as it was that the man you attacked was not Alastair Moody. The scarred man had just begun to limp through the room when Harry spoke. That's interesting. Pansy's eyes narrowed. No. 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 We are not having this before Halloween. We haven't even had classes yet. Hell, the feast hasn't even been served. Harry cocked his head at her. Whatever it is that you find interesting will undoubtedly be something dangerous to the rest of us before long. Probably this evening, if your previous track record is to be believed. I'm sorry? You said that's interesting. That always precedes some sort of chaos. Trolls and basilisks come to mind. Well, there aren't any of those around right now. That's nice. Their friends were watching the exchange with interest. What did you find so interesting? Nothing special. Professor Moody has polyjuice potion in his hip flask. Pansy looked at the man working towards the head table. That is interesting. It was just a feeling, Headmaster. I see. Well, please consider allowing a member of the staff to handle the issue next time. Dumbledore twinkled at her. If it's immediately life-threatening, I'm sure you could impose on Professor Potter. He is listed on the staff register this year as a guest lecturer. Ah, Professor Potter. The headmaster walked into his office, flanked by Snape and McGonagall. You're not sitting in my chair. This is a pleasant surprise. Harry shrugged. I conjured my own. At his feet was an insensate man with hair like straw and skin that had the unhealthy pallor of someone who never saw the sun. His leg was a mangled ruin where it had tried to reform, while the false one was in place. I reversed the shock, but he passed out from the pain anyway. That's fine. We can wake him up. I do, however, recognize him. Dumbledore sat in his chair and frowned. This is the second dead man to show up in my school in as many years. He looked at Snape and McGonagall. I haven't become senile and simply forgotten restoring necromancy as an elective, yes? No, Headmaster. McGonagall looked quietly horrified. Good. And bad. Why does my castle seem to be generating living corpses? Dumbledore smiled humorlessly. On the upside, the Ministry can't possibly object to the use of Veritaserum. It's not illegal to pour it down a corpse's throat. When I heard Crouch Jr. had died, I breathed a little easier, Snape admitted as he forced open the jaws of a man who was gritting his teeth in agony. He wasn't exactly stable before he was convicted and sentenced by his father. Not, perhaps, as directly dangerous as Bellatrix, but still quite deranged. He gave up and poured the 3 drops through the gaps Pansy's gun had left. Headmaster, I know it would be wrong of me to enjoy a man's pain, but he cost one of my lions his parents in a cruel way. That said, we may want to dull the pain so he answers questions. Harry sighed and reached down, pinching a spot on the man's shoulder. The grimace instantly turned slack. Barty Crouch Jr. Dumbledore had a dark look on his face. Let me start with the question that is most immediately pressing. Where is the real Alastor Moody? Trunk. 7th lock. Defense office. Good. Professor Potter, please be so kind as to retrieve the man and deliver him to our resident healer. To save you the trouble of breaking in and stealing my notes, I'll send you a copy when we've finished the questioning. The common room looked up when Harry walked in. He walked to the comfortable chairs by the fire and sat on the floor. Well? Pansy prompted. The headmaster will be providing me with a copy of his notes on the interview. Why? He seemed to think I would break into his office to read them if he didn't. I'm offended that he thinks I need to break in. You would be. Daphne sighed and rubbed her eyes. Is there anything you can tell us before we go to bed? Not much. It was someone named Barty Crouch. His friends stared. Former Director of Magical Law Enforcement Barty Crouch? Daphne gasped. What could he possibly want here? The man's disgraced after his son turned out to be a Death Eater. A really nasty one at that. Good thing he's dead. Yeah. About that. Harry grinned. It looks like they missed a spot. Wait. Tracy's exhaustion from life with newborns had evaporated with her interest in the current topic. Are you saying that Barty Crouch Jr. was the one pretending to be Mad-Eye Moody? Yep. Harry pulled out a ball of granite the size of his fist and a loop. A beam of light shot from his finger, and he began to carve runes on the lump of stone. He died in Azkaban, didn't he? Pansy frowned. Oi, Draco. Come here. Malfoy approached the group slowly, watching Hermione. Yes. He had no idea why he was apparently on first-name terms with Pansy again, but not being her enemy sounded like a healthy lifestyle. Does your father keep tabs on the other Death Eaters? Without admitting Death Eaterhood for him, I will say that he has always been a concerned citizen, and made a point of keeping track of those persons who have historically threatened our society. He is also close with many of the other persons whose actions during the war were ruled to have been as a result of imperious usage. Let's pretend you just said yes, shall we? Daphne muttered. Let's not. But within the scope of my previous statement, I would acknowledge that my father might well have information on a topic of a Death Eatery nature. So, for example, if I asked if Barty Crouch Jr. had died in Azkaban, I would tell you that as far as I know, yes. Why? Because he didn't. Harry's eyes stayed on his project. That is odd. Malfoy looked distinctly unsettled. Azkaban's up to 3 escapes now. Someone should do something about that. The residents are not nice people. I don't think you really want me to list the reasons they're in there. Probably for the same things your father was acquitted of? Tracy suggested, a sneer on her face. Some, Draco shrugged. But plenty of them are in there for being dangerous, sick creeps. It's where they put people who do the really nasty kinds of magic, or commit the truly disgusting sorts of crimes. Even the Death Eaters had some lines they didn't cross. Mostly. He shuddered. Loath as I am to side with Dumbledore, Millel put in. The headmaster does seem to be taking the infiltration of our school seriously. I mean, if he willingly involved Harry, he must be. Never mind that. We've had all sorts of weird teachers. I mean, have you been to care of magical creatures? The oaf's idea of what is acceptable for third years, and we had Lockhart. Compared to him, Death Eaters might as well be choir boys. Even Quirrell attacked Aurors. I'm worried about Azkaban leaking prisoners. First thing tomorrow, I'm writing my father. Running to Daddy, Draco? Pansy asked, snickering. About this? Absolutely. We're 14, Pansy, this is out of our league. He looked at Harry. Mostly. My father is owed favors. If he asks questions about this, people will have to take care of it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get some sleep. Dumbledore smiled without looking up. Lemon drop, Professor Potter? No thank you, Headmaster. You read the report? Yep. Harry leaned back in his chair and propped his feet on the headmaster's desk. I assume there's more to the story. In a way. Dumbledore looked up. Last year, Voldemort managed to escape the cage I'd stuck him in while trying to sort out why he's not dead. As you saw in the report, he's now pulling the strings of some plot to use you in a reincarnation scheme. Unfortunately, our new prisoner doesn't know anything useful about the specifics of that plan, so it will be hard to properly derail it. There are any number of methods he could be using, and the kinds of magic involved are the sort I try to avoid studying. They're not good for the soul. But that leaves us in a rather interesting predicament. I really do not wish to show our hand, so if we can arrange for this to remain quiet, that would be for the best. I'll tell Malfoy that his father shouldn't mention Barty Crouch Jr. Mr. Malfoy? I wasn't aware you were acquainted. He's sort of friends with Pansy. He was asked to confirm that the man in custody was thought dead. Malfoy was apparently disturbed to learn of a third escape from a prison filled with known felons. How does his father come into this? He's going to write him, of course. I see. Could you pass along a request that he wait for the moment? As long as no one knows that we have caught on to the deception, we have options. You mean to have the real Moody pretend to be the imposter, then? Harry smiled to himself. It's probably the only way to get further information. Indeed. Just pass along my request, no violence, please. Dumbledore scratched his chin. It will be the long con, Professor Potter. Without knowing more, we're going to have to play along until Voldemort reveals his hand. Moody will agree? Dumbledore chuckled to himself. I'm certain of it. == Arnold Lewis sat back in his comfortable office chair. It wasn't the boss's chair, of course, he wouldn't dream of sitting in Professor Potter's chair. But he had a nice chair of his own at his desk. Better still, he had a job that made great use of his skills. He'd always been more of a thinker than a doer, and even Professor Potter hadn't changed that, but being employed by the Dawn gave him the opportunity to plan out the kinds of campaigns that Professor Potter had trained him for. It was satisfying to have an employer who appreciated your indifference to human life. The Aurors had been wary of him, but now he had a fun job that always had something interesting happening. If there weren't contracts, and there were only a handful, because most people couldn't afford their rates, there was the endlessly enjoyable task of planning out any number of actions to be filed away in case of future need. If he had to admit to a downside this job, it was learning to use a Muggle computer. Professor Potter had discovered their ability to process information and cross-reference it. After that, there hadn't been a chance of avoiding the blasted machines. So, he had to use word processing programs instead of quills, though it was nice not to get ink everywhere. It didn't lead to a paperless office, for all that he'd been told that by the muggle who'd sold him the device. He had filing cabinets full of papers, magically expanded cabinets, no less. And more of them filled with backup disks, because he'd been warned that he should make sure everything was backed up. There were few things he envied about being a field operative for the Dawn, but not having to do more than fill out mission reports was one of them. On the other hand, he got to dig through the truly massive room that they had hidden away. It was filled with maps and blueprints and diagrams that he was fairly certain any authority would consider it criminal to possess. He had a dozen copies of the plans for Buckingham Palace in a file, each with his notes on different plans for infiltration and execution of a variety of tasks. 2 of them were designed for exclusively Muggle-style engagement. If he were a suspicious man, and he was, he might wonder if Professor Potter planned on bringing in Muggles. To be fair, his recent experiences with mission reports and the training required by Professor Potter meant that he had a decent respect for the ability of Muggles to do impressive things without magic, but still. An owl flew into the office and dropped a scroll on his desk. This was the best part of his job by far. He knew Professor Potter got copies of all of this stuff and did his own work, but he got access to at least a good portion of the Dawn's intelligence network. He was the one who got to go through the reports and Merlin, were there ever a lot of them, and figure out what they meant when put together. His inside knowledge of the ministry alone was probably greater than most of its employees, and that was only the tip of the iceberg. Arnold had pretty much moved into the office because there was so much to do, but it was too fun to miss. Chapter 75, Fanboy Time. Good morning, Alastair. Moody growled at his friend. Albus Dumbledore had the ability to be relentlessly cheerful at ungodly hours such as noon in the morning. What in the fuck hit me? He rasped. I don't remember being in front of a lorry. I think, old friend, that you are feeling the effects of several weeks' confinement in your own trunk by a man thought to be dead. Come again? Barty Crouch Jr. ambushed you. How did you manage to let him pull that off anyway? Stuffed you in your trunk, and proceeded to disguise himself as you with the intent of taking your place here at Hogwarts. Thankfully, one of my students decided to take matters into her hands and revealed the deception at the welcoming feast, so that was sorted out quickly enough. Of course, we had to keep you in a medical coma for a week so you could recover. Magic can only do so much, Alastair. I see. And yet, I don't think you've come for a social call. True. Dumbledore twinkled at Moody. I want to run a con on Voldemort. You're going to pretend to be Barty Crouch Jr. pretending to be you so we can find out what the plan is. I am? Yes. Oh. Sounds fun? Moody paused. It's been a week? Yes. We would have been in so much trouble if Professor Potter hadn't volunteered to cover your classes. Professor Potter is here? Moody demanded. Yes, he's about to start the 6th-year Newt's course at Dumbledore. Watched his friend bolt from the hospital bed, turning a sheet into robes and transfiguring the chair out from under him into a wooden leg. There was a clacking sound as Alastair moved far faster than anyone would expect him capable of, scuttling out of the ward and down the hall at a respectable pace. Absently, Dumbledore unbent his legs and looked around. Something I said? Albus. He blanched as his resident medic came bustling towards him, eyes narrowed. Now, Poppy, before you say anything rash. Blow that. I wanted to give the man a proper physical now that he's able to answer questions. You know he doesn't go to any medical professional, so this was the perfect opportunity to give him the lectures on his health that might keep him alive. Why did you send him on his way? I didn't. I mentioned that Professor Potter was covering for him, and he was out like a shot. I do hope he doesn't hurt anyone. He's not going to injure Potter. But can we say the reverse? Alastair, Dumbledore tried for the 3rd time to get his friend to stop reading sheets of notepaper and pay attention to him. Or, at least, to the dinner being served. The man hadn't eaten solid food in more than a week. he needed to get nutrients into him. If you don't put those down and eat dinner, I shall set them on fire. He hadn't used his teacher voice on Moody since he was a lad, but needs must. Moody grumbled as he tucked the pages away. I was trying to study for tomorrow, he grumbled. As glad as I am to see you preparing to teach. I'm attending, Albus. The third-year classes to start. I'm sorry, what? The sixth-year class was too advanced for me. I've gotten out of practice or something. I need some refreshers before I try the later classes. Alastair, are you trying to tell me you intend to be a student? A student in the class you were hired to teach? And miss the chance to study with Professor Potter? Are you mad? The Aurors are turning out some of the best recruits we've ever had, and it's thanks to him. I'm not going to give up an opportunity like this. Dumbledore sighed. Apparently, the madness that had infected his castle since Potter had come to it was contagious. It was too late to do anything about it, though. He didn't like to think about the fact that the boy was essentially building a private army. The only thing that kept him from being up late every night was that his guest lecturer clearly had no idea how loyal his students were. You'd do well to sit in on his classes, Albus. Dumbledore was pulled from his thoughts by Moody speaking through a mouthful of food. He heavily emphasizes transfiguration and conjuration. Interesting. I had gathered something of the sort from the various incident reports involving Auror trainees. No animation? Not really, no. I see. I wonder if I would be doing the world a disservice if I took it upon myself to point him in that direction. Well, I'll worry about it later. Since you're feeling more like yourself, might I ask you to put your paranoid tendencies to use? Moody cocked his head and continued to eat. I was hoping you'd examine the security for the grounds. My castle will be hosting a large number of foreigners, many of whom are related to influential persons. I don't want problems cropping up. More specifically, I want to avoid problems reaching the point that Professor Potter finds himself taking an interest. In other words, if at all possible, I'd like to avoid an international incident on the grounds. Good luck with that, Headmaster, muttered Snape. Thank you for your input, Severus. I wish to take whatever steps I can to reduce the chances. All the same, I have ordered a new mass grave dug out back. Just in case. What did I do to get so lucky? Grumbled Tracy as she stared at a rock on the floor of the common room. Harry had deposited her there after taking away her wand and ordering her to levitate the thing. The fact that this method had so far taught 5 people made no difference to her displeasure. You're used to sleepless nights, Harry explained as he began his new project. The Harry corner had been wiped clean, and he was now busily scrawling on one wall. Behind him, a stack of notebooks remained unopened, but from the pauses in his writing, it seemed that he was referencing something. So why not learn with them? Because I'd been hoping to get some sleep while away from home. She snapped. Daphne had given her a pitying look and Hermione hadn't even given her that. This is more productive. Harry motioned Tam over. Tracy had no idea why the girl was still awake, but she seemed genuinely fascinated by whatever it was Harry was working on. The two were now looking over some series of runes that Harry had doodled on the ground. Now, I'm trying to derive a common set of rules, so I can create a new version of the effect, Harry said. Just so long as you keep the power runes separate. Tam hissed. I don't need to find out what this mess does before it's ready. I already told you what it does. I'm not entirely sure I believe you. I probably should, given that you've been right so far. But that makes me even less inclined to find out, since it's unlikely to be healthy for us. From what you've said, doing this wrong will result in a distinctly unpleasant experience. If you don't dodge fast enough. Are you saying I haven't been teaching properly? No. Tam raised her hands as though warding off the thought. Not at all. Just saying that it could do damage. I have other projects I could show you. I think one will be enough for the time being. This is an interesting spell you've outlined. It's clear that they're related, but the problem is figuring out which parts are incidental. That part over there that stabilizes the connection is definitely necessary. It's just logical. Yeah. But how much of the target designation is inherent to the overall set, and how much needs to be built from scratch each time? Tracy sighed and rubbed her forehead. None of this was helping her with wandless magic. Alastair, Dumbledore held out the bowl from his desk. Care for a lemon drop? He lifted another bowl. How about one of these delightful muggle treats called warheads? No thank you, Headmaster. Dumbledore wondered why no one ever took one of his proffered candies. Perhaps he should have done something to combat the rumors that he laced them with drugs. Aside from a mild mellowness cream he sometimes popped, he tried to avoid mood-altering substances in general. And why he would continually dose himself with Veritaserum was beyond him, so how people thought he'd eat the candy he offered if it were treated like that. Does this meeting mean you've been contacted by Voldemort? Actually, I wanted to ask you who it was who attacked the fake me. That would be Miss Parkinson. She was most efficient in her assault. She shoved a firearm in his mouth. That was how I knew it couldn't be you. You'd have dodged. Parkinson? Moody's horribly maimed jaw dropped. I was saved because of a Parkinson? In fairness, I suspect she was more concerned about the imposter's presence than your predicament. Oh. Still, does that mean she's not in on it? Considering she's a friend of Professor Potter? I highly doubt she's involved. His companions are impressively loyal to him. Of course, they are. He's Professor Potter. Dumbledore sighed. Seeing the grizzled ex-Soror acting like an excited fanboy was as worrying as it was amusing. How did Professor Potter manage this? The headmaster had taken great pains to avoid knowing the exact details of Professor Potter's aggressive defense courses, but he knew enough to be quietly horrified and wished that he'd been able to avoid starting this wretched series of events in the first place. He decided to put that aside for another time. How went your inspection of security? Things are pretty solid. I noticed some additions to the wards since I was last here. Yes, well, we've had a rash of problems, and as much as Professor Potter has solved them for me, I would prefer they never reach that point. Especially on my grounds, near my students. That's why I asked you to be here this year. I've come to the realization that anything truly dangerous will be dealt with by my guest lecturer, but by that time, it may have caused more chaos than I want in my school. You had a problem with possession? Indeed. There's a reason I made being possessed by Voldemort an official infraction of school rules. And basilisks? One almost 1,000 years old, yes. It went around petrifying students. No lasting harm aside from delaying their education a bit, but I'd rather it not repeat. And Horcruxes? It was behind the basilisk problem. Professor Potter's solution was unique. I've never seen an evil soul shard reform. It came back together? No, it stopped being evil. Oh. I should probably just let you know that it's currently Ginevra Tam Riddle Weasley. She goes by Tam these days and spends much of her time learning obscure bits of magic and avoiding making trouble. The Weasley family has been a good influence, I feel. You have a shard of a soul wandering around the school? She's quite polite to almost everyone. I think the only person she's short with is Professor Potter. As far as I know, that's a nearly universal response though. That explains the red eyes. I gather you also had a problem with Animagi? 2 of them. One was Peter Pettigrew. He's dead. Funny thing, the same was said about Barty Crouch Jr. Point. The other was Sirius Black. He's innocent? I know. Who else would Amelia have look into it? I'm retired, so there's no paper trail to my investigation. By the way, did you know you have a tree patrolling the ground with a woodsman's axe? I didn't know it was patrolling, or that it had stolen Hagrid's axe, but I knew about the tree. I don't know if it'll be of any help, but it was marching along the border of the Forbidden Forest, and there were a few dead critters that I'm guessing had tried to cross. I'll leave it be, then. By the way, the changes to the wards, how recent are they? Last 3 years. Professor Potter's tenure with us has been most eventful. Oh. OMake equals. Arnold paged through the reports that had been filed that morning. Most of it was rather routine. A dictator's enemies had been quietly silenced and evidence of their treason adequately planted. Nothing special by the standards of the Dawn, but it paid the bills. Not that they were particularly expensive bills. Professor Potter had selected a small, mildly dingy office building to base their operations instead of a more luxurious setting. It kept the rent down. Besides, as trained wizards, things like space and cleanliness were more or less at will. That was why their closet had so much room, after all. There were a couple others with the usual reports of criminal activity for which the firm was being paid. Then there was Kirkbane. It had not just been a couple of pages filled out in ballpoint and sent by Owl, while the operative went home to relax. It had arrived in a shrunken archive box filled with pictures, samples, and a pair of Muggle camcorders. He was wondering how what should have been a quick job for anyone with a wand had somehow resulted in this much stuff cluttering his already full desk. All that Kirkbane had needed to do was go to Maryland and find 3 missing teenagers whose parents were not their usual sort of client. That had been one of the oddest parts, being hired by a trio of middle-class American families to investigate something that the Muggles could surely handle themselves. Or perhaps not, given the things Arnold was now going through. He set the camcorders aside for later examination and instead started with the pictures. Moments later, he was summoning a reference book and comparing them. This was some seriously fucked up shit they'd been sent to deal with, it seemed. There was an effigy made of sticks and hair glued together with something suspiciously reddish-brown and gooey too. It took him an hour and a half to come up with a few possible answers for what in the hell had been out there, and none of the answers were really comforting. The good news was that 2 of the teens had been found alive. Ish. Kirkbane included a rather detailed account of their catatonic state. It was going to be a problem. Arnold wasn't sure how they could return the kids to their parents like this. This looked like a job for the Obliviators. But they didn't farm out work at the Dawn, and Arnold had been hired to deal with this stuff, so Professor Potter didn't have to. That meant he had to make a couple of tough choices. His letter back to Kirkbane first instructed him to deliver the teens to a safe house for now, and then included the rest of his marching orders. In the meantime, Arnold had a good bit of work ahead of him. He had to find someone who specialized in therapeutic magic to induct into the Dawn, despite their outfit not really being the kind of place those folks liked to work. And he had to figure out how to tell the parents that one child was dead through causes he couldn't discuss, while the other 2 were going to need to recover before they could be returned. Technically, the Dawn had only been hired to find them, but Arnold felt that returning them in less than functioning condition might not live up to what was expected of the firm. And there was the last task, but thankfully, that one was in Kirkbane's hands. Oh, and he had to figure out how to explain this to Professor Potter. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.